Welcome, everybody. This is a very special day in Jewish history. We are in the midst of what David Hartman has called the High Holy Days of modern Jewish history, the movement from Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, to Yom HaZikaron, which is the Memorial Day for the fallen Israeli fighters, to Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day. And we're meeting at a very special time. For me, this is a personal delight because we're going to have a session with my colleague and friend, and I would dare say sparring mate, because we enjoy each other, appreciate each other, esteem each other, admire each other, do everything but agree with each other. And therefore, this may get a little bit less, what shall we say, less easy and placid than normal. But Rick Richman, who is a scholar of Zionism and has written a very important new book, And None Shall Make Them Afraid, 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel. Before he became a scholar of Zionism, or as he became a scholar of Zionism, he was a very distinguished and is a very distinguished lawyer. And for the last several years, he's been a scholar in residence at American Jewish University, my colleague down the hall, and we discuss and disagree on events quite every day. For me, this is also personal in a very different way. I spent last week, to give you an itinerary, I was in Auschwitz twice, in Belzec, in Majdanek and Treblinka. I was part of the March Living, in which 12,000 Jews from literally all over the world came to march between Auschwitz and Birkenau. Auschwitz is the name of a camp, but it's actually Auschwitz I, and Birkenau was the killing center. The group has gone on to Israel. I did not go on to Israel. I came back here. So this is my sojourn with Israel and in Israel at this particularly turbulent time. So let's begin first of all and say, welcome, Rick, welcome to the audience, and thank you for being with us. Rick, tell us why you wrote this book, and tell us why you chose the characters you chose.
Well, what I was trying to do was teach the history of Zionism, the 125 years since Herzl, more in a way that was different than it had been taught before, because usually what you get is something from the 30,000 foot level with broad themes of history, of politics, of diplomacy, of military operations. And I wanted to bring it down from 30,000 feet all the way to the bottom and show what individuals had done and what they had committed themselves to, either early in their life, midlife, or even later in their life, and accomplished. And what I found was that for each of the 8 individuals I selected, some of them were well known, some of them lesser known, some of them perhaps not known. But in each case, what I did was try to tell a story close to the beginning that would give readers a sense of what Zionism was to these people when they encountered it. And so each chapter can really be read at random. Each one is a fascinating tidbit of these people's lives. But what I found was that if I put them in chronological order, what I would have is, in effect, a history of Zionism, a history of Israel before it became a state, as it struggled to survive as a state, and as it succeeded as a state. And I found it was almost like an invisible baton being passed from generation to generation, from person to accomplish something that's widely acknowledged to be a miracle.
So let me ask you, tell us who you included, and then I'll ask you the second half of that question. How the hell did you decide who not to include? I mean, there are very curious, very interesting, very fascinating inclusions and equally fascinating exclusions.
So we start with Herzl back in 1895, when he's the 35-year-old literary editor of a Viennese newspaper. And he comes out with this idea for a Jewish state. And people think he's crazy. Some of them thought he was literally crazy. And then in between, going all the way to the end with Ron Dermer and Benjamin Netanyahu, you have 120 years later, not only do you have the Jewish state that Herzl predicted, not only has it survived in its war of independence and multiple wars and terrorist operations and rocket bombings and tunnel incursions after that, but the prime minister of Israel is doing something that no other world leader did except for Winston Churchill, which is speak 3 times to a joint meeting of the US Congress. That's an amazing story in a short period of time, given the history of the Jewish people, given history in general. So I went from Herzl then to Louis Brandeis, who was the key to American Zionism. And then I went to Chaim Weizmann, who was born in Model, an 8,000 person shtetl where he spent his first 11 years, and then went alone west to Germany in order to get an education, and somehow 30 years later ended up in London and was a key to the Balfour Declaration. And then we go to Vladimir Jabotinsky.
And let's also remind our audiences that he then became the first president of Israel.
Became the first president of Israel.
Just a minor achievement.
Yeah, most people will recall him from the picture of him standing next to President Truman a couple days after Israel declared its independence, and President Truman recognized the state of Israel 11 minutes later. Not many people know that as they're standing there, Weizmann is handing a very small but historic Torah to President Truman. The Torah was one that was owned at that time by the Jewish Theological Seminary. It had been written in honor of a boy's bar mitzvah in 1940, been used in World War II, returned to the JTS, which gave it to Weizmann to give to Truman. They're standing there, and all you see in the picture is the two of them standing there. But what Truman said to Weizmann when he got the Torah was, "Thanks, I've always wanted one of those." And so they had a relationship that anecdote reflects.
There also is an apocryphal anecdote that they were bemoaning it. Harry Truman was alleged to have said, "It's difficult to be the president of 150 million Americans." And Weizmann was said to have answered, "It's even more difficult to be the president of 1.5 million presidents."
Yeah, and to have everyone a prime minister or a potential one, throughout your term of office. So
by the way, that Torah is still on display in the Truman Library, proudly on display in the Truman Library. Yeah. So you go, and then you go to Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky is not well known in the non-Israeli context, but Jabotinsky, tell us about him. He's the one who did not, he and Herzl are the two people in your book who did not, Herzl and Brandeis, I guess, are the 3 people who didn't live to see the establishment of the state of Israel.
And Jabotinsky was an extraordinary person. He was a novelist, he was an essayist, he was a poet, he was a translator, he was a journalist, and he was instrumental in forming the Jewish Legion, the first organized Jewish military force outside of Eretz Israel in almost 2 millennia. He was the key person. And he also, and this is really the subject of my first book, Racing Against History, he was the key person in trying to develop support for a Jewish army to fight Hitler in 1940, the first full year of the war that Hitler brought. So while America was sleeping, Jabotinsky came to America to try to generate support among the Jewish community and the wider Jewish community. He's a very eloquent, important guy. The story that I tell in the book is not that was my first book. The story in this book is a story of how in 1937, when the Peel Commission issued its report, Jabotinsky met personally with Winston Churchill and asked him to oppose the partition proposal in the Peel Commission, which would have been what Jabotinsky said, a postage stamp of a state in Palestine, which would have been easily and quickly overrun by the neighboring Arab armies, and Jewish history might have effectively ended at that point. And Churchill took some of the very paragraphs from the memorandum that Jabotinsky provided him and put it into an op-ed opinion that he wrote at the time, was widely circulated in the United States. So
And this was when Churchill was in power, or before this is before he was in power. In 37, he was not yet, because our audience is not going to fully know that, he was not yet prime minister.
Not yet, but he was
unlikely that he was going to be prime minister, except for the events that transpired.
Right. He was a prophet of not appeasing Germany, but preparing to stop them. And he became, as we all know, prime minister in 1940. But in 1937, when this happened, he was a very influential member of parliament. And because of his opposition, the Peel Commission map was not adopted by the parliament. Instead, they sent it back. They had a substitute resolution by Churchill to send it back to the League of Nations for further study, which effectively meant the end of it. So Jabotinsky played, and that's only one of the things that he did, but he played a very, very influential role. And then I go from him to Golda Meir. Golda Meir, she's remarkable. We all remember her, I think, or we visualize her at least, as the 71-year-old grandmother who became prime minister and served for 5 years before she resigned after the Yom Kippur War. But what I do is in the book is try to tell the little-known story about her, which takes her all the way back to growing up in Kiev, in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, anti-Semitic Russia, where pogroms send her father to the United States to try and find a place to live and a job. He moves to Milwaukee, and then 3 years later sends for his wife and their 3 young daughters. And Golda's mother and she and her 2 sisters walk to the border. They use border bribes. They use all their money for that. They get out. They get to Milwaukee, and she's amazed to see the world that her father is living in Milwaukee, in America, because there he's marching in a parade and the police are on horseback protecting him. Whereas in Russia, if anybody marched, particularly a worker, the police would be there under horseback, but they'd be whipping people. So she saw the worst of autocracy and the best of democracy in America at that time. She also saw socialism succeeding. Milwaukee had a socialist mayor. The congressman was a socialist. There were socialist mayors in 3 or 4 other cities, in Minnesota and in Berkeley and elsewhere. And she decided she wanted to take her Jewish heritage and her socialist ideals and go to Palestine at the age of 23. And she was a factor in Zionist politics all the way up to becoming the prime minister in 1969. You got to understand how she grew up and what she experienced in order to understand Golda Meir. It's a fascinating story, but again, it's part of this baton passed from generation to generation. And then we go to Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht, at the time, the most highly paid screenwriter in Hollywood history. He, born at the turn of the century, grew up in the Lower East Side, attended the University of Wisconsin for 1 day, and then moved to Chicago because he wanted to become a writer. He writes a very well-received novel. At age 27, he becomes a national literary figure. He becomes a journalist of national repute. And then he gets a telegram, probably the most famous telegram from Herman Mankiewicz in Hollywood about this new industry of filmmaking in Hollywood. And Mankiewicz says to him, I want you to pay you $300 a week to come out to Hollywood and write screenplays for me. The $300 is peanuts, he says, but there are millions to be made out here and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. So Ben Hecht moves to Hollywood and he proceeds to write in 1 week the screenplay for the first gangster movie in Hollywood history. And then he writes Scarface, which is the second, and makes a whole new genre of gangster films. He does romantic comedies. He does Notorious eventually, which is one of the most famous Hitchcock films. And then in 1939 comes Kristallnacht. And later that year, the war. And in 1941, he said, in his own words, I was walking down the street and I bumped into history.
Rick, let me only correct you. 38 is
38, Kristallnacht 38. Munich and yeah, correct.
I wouldn't.
Poland in 39.
I wouldn't ordinarily correct the guest, but A, you're not a guest, and B, I'm not going to allow you to make a mistake.
Thank you. Anyway, Ben Hecht meets the person he meets is a 27-year-old unknown person named Peter Bergson, which is a pseudonym for Hillel Kook. He's one of Jabotinsky's followers. He educates Ben Hecht about Jabotinsky, and Ben Hecht, who has had no Jewish involvement, no interest in Jerusalem, no desire to speak before any groups. He's a writer. He agrees to become the head of Bergson's committee to fight for a Jewish army to fight Hitler and then to save the Jews in Europe. And the story of what he did as a single individual dwarfs what Jewish organizations did during those years. It's a fascinating example of what an individual can do in history.
We also should say this is the 80th anniversary of the pageant that he wrote, We Shall Not Die, or We Shall Never Die, which was performed in places like Madison Square Garden, at the Hollywood Bowl, performed in Washington, D.C., calling attention in 1943. Calling attention in 1943 to the plight of the Jews of Europe, and featuring all of the great actors, many of whom were not at ease coming out and being identified as Jews, but on this they took a stand, and it was the attempt to inform the world of what was happening. One of the people who attended in Washington, D.C. was no less than Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, and what it indicates is that people knew what was going on. They didn't know everything. We obviously didn't learn the details of the concentration camps and other things until after, but we knew enough. And when Ben Hecht wrote, We Shall Never Die, there were 3 to 4 million Jews still alive. 2 million Jews had been murdered. The State Department in the end of November 1942 had confirmed to Stephen S. Wise that 2 million Jews had been murdered. So people knew what was going on, but
let me also say that Stephen Wise then went public, and the State Department, and I say this with shame, the State Department then undercut him because they said we can neither confirm nor deny this report. They let him out. They hung him out to dry.
Yeah.
And, so they confirmed it, and then they refused to confirm it in the public, because we have to remember that's part of the American silence. And Ben Hecht was this whirlwind of activity against silence and the like.
And because of what Ben Hecht did, which was to write a long article that became the script for the pageant called We Shall Never Die, what he did in doing that and taking it across the country, and as you say, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote it was the most moving pageant she'd ever seen in her nationally syndicated column. And then it ended up, as you said, at the Hollywood Bowl, covered by NBC radio nationwide. And what that did by doing that throughout 1943.
And let's remember that this was before television was widely available. It was just an experimental stage. So when you say radio, people were sitting around in the living room listening to radio as we might have sat around as you and I were growing up listening to television as a family and hearing it and being moved by it.
Yeah.
I don't want the younger people not to understand when you say NBC radio, they think of, you got 100 channels and you're listening to a minor broadcast somewhere.
At least more than 100,000 people saw it in person, and way more than that heard it on national radio. And there weren't competing media other than maybe CBS and ABC back then. So everybody heard it. And in 1944, when Henry Morgenthau came to FDR and said, you're preparing for your campaign for a fourth term here, there's a scandal going on in the State Department. They are not just ignoring the problem of the Jews in Europe, they're actively suppressing the information and taking steps against it. And because Ben Hecht had made this not an issue to be discussed in private at the White House, but nationally known, that's one of the major reasons, not the only, but one of the major reasons why FDR established in January of 1944 the War Refugee Board, which saved, according to Rebecca Erbelding's account for the Holocaust Memorials Team, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Jews. And as we know in Jewish tradition, every person is a world. So Ben Hecht was responsible for saving, without leaving the country, many lives by what he did in 1943 and before, and certainly what he caused the Roosevelt administration to do in 1944.
What was his role in establishing the state of Israel, or in pushing for the state of Israel?
Okay, Ben Hecht, it's a great question, because after the war, in 1948, he received a letter from Menachem Begin, who was in his 30s and was the leader of the Irgun that was fighting the British at that time. And they had never met.
Again, let's also say you're talking about continuity, really, from Jabotinsky to Peter Bergson to Ben Hecht to Menachem Begin, who was really the man who took over the role that Jabotinsky would have played had he lived.
Absolutely. And so Ben Hecht, so Begin writes a telegram to Ben Hecht saying, we're fighting here, but we need the American Jews to support us. And Ben Hecht gives a remarkable speech. I've got several paragraphs from it in the book, the whole, and a link to the original speech, which really ought to be one of the speeches that every young Jewish student reads and is familiar with. And this remarkable speech ends with an incredible line, which says, a David is fighting Goliath in the land of Israel, buy him a stone. And that one speech in one evening raised the equivalent of several $1 million in today's dollars. And so Ben Hecht, he's an example of the power of the individual, the power of words, the power of commitment to an idea, even if you come to it late in life, as he did, his first 40, 50 years, no connection with Zionism or the Jewish community. And then he does things which saves Jewish lives, leads to material support for the fight for a Jewish state. And he continued that even after 1948.
So take us now to the man who brought the English language to fight. I guess we can say Ben Hecht also brought the English language to the battle for Jewish state, but Ben Hecht did it with an earthy language. The next person you're going to talk about did it in a very highbrow. The Jewish people's eloquent spokesman.
And once again, we remember him or think of him as this extraordinary Israeli diplomat who gave 25 years of speeches before the UN and in Washington of incredible eloquence. But what I do in the book is go back to the beginning, when he was first appointed as Israel's representative to the UN.
By the way, we're all talking about Abba Eban in case the younger members of the audience don't remember that.
Yeah, and Abba Eban is 33 years old. He's a former professor at Oxford or Cambridge of Hebrew literature, Arabic literature, Persian literature. He's an academic, and he takes the position, and 5 days later, 5 days after Israel declares its independence and is invaded by 5 Arab armies, there is Abba Eban, 33 years old, the youngest person at the UN, in front of the UN Security Council representing Israel. And he gives his first speech of incredible eloquence. I'm just paraphrasing here, but what he said is, in that speech is, look, our millennia-long struggle to revive ourselves. Our state is not going to be surrendered at pistol point. The Arabs can have peace with Israel if they want. They can have war with Israel if that's what they want. But either way, they're going to have it with Israel. And his speech electrified public opinion in Israel. It electrified public opinion in the United States. And it's another indication of the power of words, the power of language. We're the people of the book, we're the people of words, we're the people of speeches, we're the people of expressing the highest ideals and ideas in language that can motivate people. And Abba Eban is certainly one of the best examples. And the important thing to remember about him is he wasn't Abba Eban when he started. He was a 33-year-old professor of literature who nevertheless gave speeches that moved world history.
I'll tell you, we've always spoken about, there's a great anecdote, which is David Ben-Gurion said after he heard Abba Eban defend the Battle of 1956, when Israel invaded the Sinai. Ben-Gurion said, "I wasn't sure that my policy was correct until I heard Eban defend it. And then it had to be correct because he had given such an eloquent defense of it." And your last character, and you know what's coming because we've discussed it again. Your last character is not a historic character. He's a man whose career is unfinished, and he's in the center of the action today. Tell us about your choice of Ron Dermer.
Okay, so Ron Dermer is in one sense an anomalous choice because the first 7 people in the book are historic people who've finished their lives. We've had the opportunity to evaluate, study what they did. And as you know, Ron Dermer is, if anything, in the middle of his career. He couldn't be called a historic figure, at least not yet. So why is he in there? And the reason he's in there is for exactly those reasons. The reason he's in there is that this is not just a history book of what happened in the past. It's a book that attempts to show people that individuals matter, that individuals can do things, and that individuals start out not as heroic or historic figures, but simply as people committed to an ideal and an idea. And Ron Dermer grew up in Miami Beach. His father was the mayor of the city. His older brother was the mayor of the city. He went to the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, an Ivy League college. He then was on his way to Oxford to study politics, economics, and principles, the basic course there. He had no idea he was going to end up in Israel. He went there to help Natan Sharansky establish his new party of Russian immigrants. And then Benjamin Netanyahu appointed him economic minister in Washington, D.C. And in order to do that, under U.S. law, Dermer was required to give up his American citizenship. And when you give up your American citizenship, there's a one-page form that the State Department makes you sign. The one page, and there's a lot of white space on the one page, because what it's designed to do is emphasize that you're giving up something extraordinarily valuable, American citizenship. You can't get it back. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you willing to say so under penalty of perjury? And so not only did Dermer sign that document, but he also attached to it a 625-word essay. The essay was called "Proud to Have Been an American." And it's an extraordinary statement of one of the things that is the theme of my book, which is the alliance between Zionism and Americanism in the 20th century. Americanism is the civil religion that we've always had of democracy and freedom, something we've wanted at home and wanted for others in the world. And Zionism, which people tend to think because of its name is a particular Jewish thing, is really Jewish nationalism attempting to create a free and democratic state. So
before we transition to one of our questions, which is going to really go to the core of the contemporary issues, let's go back to the figure who worked that out, whom we didn't touch, which is Louis Brandeis, because Brandeis made Zionism acceptable to Americans, and he said, the better American you are, the better Zionist you are, and the better Zionist you are, the better American you are.
Yeah, so Brandeis
What did he mean by that, and how the hell did he do that? And tell us about him, because his Jewish journey was also very interesting.
It absolutely was, since he was born in Louisville, Kentucky. He went to Harvard Law School at age 18. He didn't go to college. He went straight to Harvard Law School. He graduated in 2 years with the best grades in the history of the school. He became a very successful.
And you say that as a Harvard graduate?
Yeah, it doesn't get better than that. The highest grades in the history of that school. And he then becomes a very successful, very wealthy attorney. And for his first 30 years of practice, no connection with Jewish organizations, no contributions out of his substantial assets and substantial annual income, more than millions of dollars in terms of today's dollars. He doesn't contribute to Jewish. He never went to shul. He didn't have a bar mitzvah. No connection. And what happened is one of those chance events that happen, like Herzl coming along, like Weizmann showing up somehow in London and affecting the Balfour Declaration. He has a meeting with Jacob de Haas. Jacob de Haas was Herzl's leader at 25 years old in London for the British Zionist movement. And he moved to America.
By the way, if there's a theme which should excite young people, is the leadership, the transformative leadership of the Zionist movement and of the creation of Zionism, were a bunch of, relatively speaking, young people who shook up the establishment, transformed it. I mean, the tragedy of Theodor Herzl was he died at 44.
Yeah. Died at age 44 after 9 years of incredible effort. With Brandeis, though, first 30 years, nothing. Then all of a sudden he meets Jacob Haas. He has a conversation that goes all afternoon with Jacob Haas. And as a result of that conversation, Jacob Haas telling him about Herzl, Brandeis spends the summer doing what he did, as a lawyer and eventually on the Supreme Court, which he researched everything he could find. And when you read the things that he read back then, speeches by Herzl, essays by Max Nordau, essays by Jabotinsky, you get a sense of the moral force, the intellectual force, the literary quality of the early Zionist writings. And you can see how someone like Brandeis would see that it was something that he himself had missed and ought to be interested in. Now, to get to your quote, to get to the quote, what he saw was that the Jewish people had a heritage that they had effectively given away. They had come to America to escape history, not to continue it. And what Brandeis saw was that a Jewish state was necessary, yes, as a refuge for the Jews who were not fortunate enough to be in America, but he also thought it would inspire American Jews to contribute out of their 3,500-year history and culture something to the American experiment, which is why he said, in order to be better Americans, we need to be better Jews. And to be better Jews, we need to be Zionists. That was a statement that electrified American Jews as much as Herzl's, if you will it is no dream, did 2 decades before that.
Okay, we've been asked, Rick, can you talk a bit about Jabotinsky, about the revisionist philosophy, and how that continues into disputes about the territorial future of Israel and the fissures of Israel, and also just to give you 1 minute more to speak on it, we'll give you 30 seconds on this, the influence of Jabotinsky's philosophy on Netanyahu's father and on Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, let's do that.
Got 30 seconds to answer that.
Okay, I'm going to use most of my 30 seconds to answer that last point. when Jabotinsky was in America in 1940, his private secretary, what we would call executive assistant today, was Benzion Netanyahu, who would be the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. And so there was a straight line from
who was also then a very young man.
Who was a very young man. If you look at pictures of him, he looks just like Bibi as a young man. And the successor to Jabotinsky was Menachem Begin. So intellectually, it went from Jabotinsky to Menachem Begin, eventually to Benjamin Netanyahu, who learned about Jabotinsky his entire life through his father, who was one of Jabotinsky's closest aides. Go ahead.
Why didn't you write about David Ben-Gurion?
Okay. I didn't write about David Ben-Gurion. I also didn't write about Menachem Begin. So it wasn't a left or right thing. The reason I didn't write about either of them, although both of them make appearances in the book in connection with the other stories, the reason I didn't write about them is that they're relatively well known. You can say their names to people and people will know who you're talking about. Some of these other names you won't, and certainly the stories you won't. And so what I was trying to do was tell this story from person to person, generation to generation, of this invisible baton all the way up to the present, and ending with Dermer, not to compare Dermer to these historic figures, but to emphasize that a baton was passed to people like him and passed to people like us, because this story is not just a story of history. It's a story of our heritage in the present. It's a story about what we've been given and what we have an obligation to pass on to those who come after us. And even more famous than Brandeis's statement about being a better Jew, needing to be a Zionist, and to be a better American, is the statement he said that history, the Jewish history, is a trusteeship. It's a heritage that we've been given, and we are charged to carry forward into the future what others in the past have borne so well. And that sense of history as a continuum that covers the past, the present, and the future is something that is not necessarily just Jewish, of course not. I found one of the things I found after I wrote the book is a statement from Roger Scruton, a British public intellectual, about history. He said, "We do not merely study the past, we inherit it. And the inheritance brings with it not only rights of ownership, but the duties of trusteeship. Things fought for and died should not be idly squandered, for they are the property of others who are not yet born." And the real reason I wrote the book is my own situation. These are stories I myself didn't know. And I got a fabulous secular education and a pretty good Jewish education. And as I was writing it, I would always ask myself, how come I didn't know this? Why didn't my teachers teach it to me? And the answer was my teachers didn't know it either. Somewhere along the way, we lost these stories. And if we could recover them, and that's what I'm trying to do with my book, is we could teach them and we could pick up the baton that's been passed to us and make sure it's not dropped and carried into the future. And so that Israel has not only a 75th anniversary, but many more after that.
Let's also say something, and I say this as a historian. Israel's 75th anniversary, with all the tension today, and we're going to touch on that for a moment, Israel is now sovereign and independent longer than any other period in Jewish history. And if we don't screw it up, we have a chance of eclipsing every one of the past records. But think of the vaunted career of David and Solomon. And even if you go back to Saul, David, and Solomon, you're not talking about 75 years. Think of the Maccabean revolt that celebrated at Hanukkah. And at the end of 40, 50 years, the Maccabeans were not exactly independent. I want to, and you're expecting this because we've been doing this as you wrote the book. I read the book in its iterations and challenged a couple. Dermer is a character who, if history goes in a certain direction, could be regarded as ending the great affinity between America and Israel, and
Yeah.
it's to the degree that he alienates and politicizes what had hitherto been a bipartisan support for Israel. It's enormously dangerous. And also, the title of your book is "None Shall Make Them Afraid." And it seems to me that Israel has reason to fear. It's the response to fear that is the difference between and how the tools that it has to grapple with fear. But you can't tell me that Iran does not scare the Israelis as they're grappling with the question, how do we respond and how do we deal with somebody who might gain nuclear weapons and offer us nuclear annihilation? And even if we have the ability to respond to a first strike and eradicate Iran, that doesn't solve the problem if Iran nuclear attacks with nuclear weapons Israel. It strikes me the only justification for Dermer is that he believes that being afraid is the proper response.
Let me disagree respectfully with your characterization of Dermer, and then I want to talk about the 75 years and then come to the situation of Iran and what ought to be done. Dermer gave a series of great speeches that I've got excerpted or linked in the endnotes to my book. And one of the ones he gave addressed this problem of whether Israel, which is supported more enthusiastically these days by Republicans than Democrats in general, what he thought about that. And he used a metaphor which he's used in many occasions, which is, yes, that may be true, but an airplane can't fly with one wing. You got to have two. And I think that represents his point of view. And he is currently Prime Minister Netanyahu's principal representative on this committee that is meeting with President Herzog to try and resolve the judicial reform crisis that Israel is going through now. In other words, Netanyahu has put his principal asset, a man who believes that you ought to have both wings together if you can do it, as the lead person on that committee. And one of the reasons he's on that committee is not only that, but also because Prime Minister Netanyahu has three main issues: Iran, Iran, and Iran. And he recognizes, I believe, and Dermer recognizes, that the judicial reform issue needs to be resolved in order to focus the attention of the entire country on the existential threat from Iran. The judicial crisis and the reform discussions that are going on, to me, divisive as they are a tribute to Israeli democracy, because in no other state in that region, and not many in the world, could you have a constitutional issue of this sort in a country without a constitution, where people not only feel free, but actually follow through with protests, with speaking out, with being in the streets week after week. Nobody's arrested, nobody's shot. The discussion is continuing. It's now at the highest levels with the government trying to resolve it. That's an amazing tribute to Israel. And let me say about the 75 years. Let's say let's compare with what happened in American history. The United States was established in 1789 with the adoption of the Constitution. At that time, they had a written constitution, they had recognized borders, they had no existential external threat. 75 years later, 1864, they're in the middle of they're in the fourth year of a horrific civil war. Israel, 75 years later, is dealing with these constitutional issues the way they ought to be dealt with. And Ron Dermer is at the center of that. So more power to him. And finally, Iran. You are correct. It's an existential threat. And to the extent that people are making judicial reform a divisive issue, it's a strategic threat to Israel itself. And I would say that the United States is making that error too. We have heard nothing from the Biden administration, at least from the president, about Iran's going to 84% purification of uranium, which is a stone's throw from nuclear weapons capacity. Nothing. But the administration has had plenty to say about judicial reform, which at the end of the day is an internal issue for Israel. And the direction ought to be different. We ought to join and encourage efforts as Americans to resolve the judicial issue, but not take a side, and let that Israeli process, democratic process, play out, and turn our attention and let Israel turn its attention to Iran.
Well, not taking, I'm going to challenge you on the not taking a side. I think we have a tremendous, and my writings. I've written somewhat extensively on this in the last year or so. One of the geniuses of the American system has been checks and balances. And if we have a contribution to make, it's checks and balances. And part of what many of the people who are fighting the quotation marks judicial reform issue are primarily concerned about the issue of checks and balances, which is that essentially the government in power cannot have the capacity to exert its agenda without any restraint. And if Israel doesn't have a constitution, it has this amorphous thing called basic laws, the Declaration of Independence, and all of that. And consequently, I find, and this is both my personal experience and my writing, we've shared it again, I find that the change in the Supreme Court and the question of the government being able to overrule the Supreme Court with 61 votes, that changes because there's been a westernization of the Israelis as they participate in Western society, as they come to America, as they experience democracy in this element. The rest of judicial reform is not dividing Israel as much as that primary issue of the question of whether the Supreme Court ultimately has a place to stand.
Since we're running out of time, let me just respond 10 seconds on that. I wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal that they published at the beginning of February when the issue first of judicial reform first came out. And what I said in that letter was, you need a check and balance on the Knesset and the Prime Minister, and to the extent a reform eliminates that, of course, you would oppose it. You also need a check or balance on the Supreme Court itself, which currently is largely a self-appointing body that holds at least a veto on who gets on the court and can overrule any governmental decision, even an appointment of a cabinet minister or a policy that doesn't present a legal issue if it's unreasonable, quote unquote. That's a court that for the last 25 years, people in Israel have realized is not subject to a check and balance. And Yuval Levin, a distinguished American public intellectual, wrote an article about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, in which he suggested that the way out for Israel from the judicial reform crisis is to consider the genius of the American founding with the checks and balances and the separation of powers on every governmental organization, including the court. If we can get there, they can get there, that's the solution.
But that's not that. Look, Israel doesn't have a constitution. What's bringing people out to this, bringing people out to the streets is the idea that, and it's ironically not a question of democracy, because if democracy is only majoritarian rule, then it's democratic. This government was elected. Nobody challenges its legitimacy. We don't have anybody speaking about a stolen election. We in America have a segment of the population challenging the legitimacy of the government and the like. But a majoritarian rule without restraint for a sense of human rights, human dignity, minority rights. You know this in Jewish history, that has always been a catastrophe for the Jewish people. We are going to have to cut it here, only because we could go on easily for another hour or so and enjoy ourselves and wrestle with it. Rick, thank you. Let me again repeat, the name of the book is "And None Shall Make Them Afraid, 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel." And it has a blurb on it, which, if I can read it, says, a tour de force which is as brilliant as it is beautiful. Now, we know your mother didn't write that, but that's by Norman Podhoretz, who is not ordinarily a man who gives out compliments easily. And I can say that even when I think you're wrong, I always think you're interesting and persuasive. And it's a book well worth reading. Thank you very much for joining us, Rick. I'm honored to have you as a colleague, and I cherish you as a friend. And we thank the audience for being with us.
Likewise, Michael. Thank you.